Stand on the white cliffs of Dover on a windy morning, and in front of you is a narrow strip of cold, grey water, the English Channel. Today, it's just over 30 kilometers wide, but more than 2,000 years ago, this wasn't just a distance, it was a boundary. On one side stood the Roman Empire, the center of power, law, and military dominance. On the other side lay Britannia, an island wrapped in fog, known to the Romans for its metals, its tribal societies, and its resistance to control. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar decided to cross that boundary. At the time, he was under increasing political pressure back in Rome. His power depended on military success, and he needed a campaign that would elevate his status. Britannia was not valuable because it was easy to conquer, but because it had never been conquered. It represented the edge of the known world. When Roman ships approached the southern coast of Britain, they faced immediate challenges. There were no proper harbors to land in. The coastline was difficult, with strong waves and elevated ground where local warriors could defend from above. Roman soldiers, carrying heavy armor and equipment, had to disembark directly into deep water, breaking formation as they struggled toward the shore. Under pressure and unfamiliar conditions, they hesitated. According to Caesar's own account, a standard-bearer of the 10th Legion jumped forward first into the water and urged the others to follow, appealing to their sense of honor. That moment helped restore momentum, and the Romans managed to establish a foothold. Caesar returned again in 54 BC with a larger force. This time, he advanced further inland, crossed the Thames, and defeated a coalition of British tribes. Several local leaders agreed to submit and provide tribute, but once again, there was no permanent occupation. No cities were built, no administrative system was established. After securing political agreements, Caesar withdrew his forces back to Gaul. On the surface, these expeditions might appear incomplete, but strategically they achieved their purpose. Caesar did not need to hold Britain. He needed the prestige of reaching it. By demonstrating that he could project power beyond the known limits of Roman control, he strengthened his position at home. Britannia became part of his narrative of expansion, not a province to govern. Nearly a century later, the situation changed completely. In AD 43, Emperor Claudius launched a full-scale invasion of Britain. Unlike Caesar, Claudius was not seeking symbolic success. He needed a decisive military victory to legitimize his rule. Considered weak and unproven by the Roman elite, he turned to Britannia as an opportunity to secure authority through conquest. This time, the Romans committed significant resources. Around 40,000 troops, organized into 4 legions, crossed the Channel and landed in southeastern Britain. As they moved inland, they encountered a form of warfare unfamiliar to them: British chariots. These fast-moving units disrupted Roman formations, striking quickly and withdrawing before a counterattack could be organized. However, Roman strength lay in discipline and adaptability. The legions adjusted their tactics, maintained formation, and advanced methodically, defeating resistance tribe by tribe. At a key moment in the campaign, Claudius himself arrived in Britain. His presence was not only political but also psychological. According to historical sources, he brought war elephants with him, an overwhelming and unfamiliar sight for the local population. The impact was immediate. Faced with Roman military organization and symbolic displays of power, multiple British rulers chose to submit. In total, 11 kings acknowledged Roman authority. Claudius remained in Britain for only 16 days. That was enough to receive formal surrenders and declare victory. He then returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. But unlike Caesar's expeditions, this invasion did not end with withdrawal. The Roman army stayed. Between AD 43 and AD 50, the Romans began establishing control over southern and eastern Britain. Administrative centers were developed, land was reorganized, and Britannia was formally incorporated as a province of the Roman Empire. However, this control was never absolute. In the west, particularly in Wales, resistance continued for decades. In the north, beyond the frontier, Roman influence remained limited. This created a fundamental tension. Rome had achieved military dominance in key regions, but it had not fully secured the island. The empire controlled the centers of power, but the edges remained unstable. And it was this incomplete control, this gap between conquest and true authority, that would soon lead to one of the most dangerous uprisings Rome would ever face in Britain. Nearly 2 decades after the Roman invasion of AD 43, Britannia was not a stable province, it was a controlled one. Beneath the surface of Roman roads, new towns, and administrative order, tension had been building quietly. The system Rome imposed worked efficiently for the empire, but not always for the people forced to live under it. That tension would erupt in AD 60, triggered not by a foreign invasion, but by a decision made within Rome's own system of control. At the center of this crisis was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in eastern Britain. Her husband, Prasutagus, had ruled as a client king allowed to maintain limited autonomy under Roman oversight. When he died, he attempted to secure peace by naming the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his daughters. In theory, this was a compromise. In practice, it exposed a weakness in Rome's approach to governance. Instead of honoring the agreement, Roman officials moved to annex the Iceni kingdom outright. Their lands were seized, their wealth was taken. When Boudica protested, she was publicly flogged, and her daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers. This was not just punishment, it was a message. Client kingdoms were no longer semi-independent allies, they were territories waiting to be absorbed. What followed was not a spontaneous rebellion, but a rapid consolidation of anger that had been building for years. Tribes that had endured taxation, land confiscation, and legal inequality now had a focal point. Boudica became that focal point. Within a short time, she assembled a force that may have reached tens of thousands, far larger than any Roman force immediately available in the region. At that moment, the Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning far to the west, on the island of Anglesey, targeting Druids, religious leaders Rome considered a source of resistance. With the main Roman force absent, the eastern province was exposed. Boudica moved quickly. Her first target was Camulodunum, the former capital of Roman Britain and a symbol of occupation. It was a Roman colony populated largely by retired soldiers, with a massive temple dedicated to Emperor Claudius at its center. To the local population, this was more than a city, it was a statement of dominance. The city had minimal defenses. When Boudica's forces arrived, it fell quickly. The temple, where survivors attempted to hold out, was besieged and destroyed. Archaeological evidence still shows a thick layer of burned debris beneath the site, confirming the scale of destruction. Rome attempted to respond. The 9th Legion moved to intercept the rebellion, but it was caught in open terrain and overwhelmed. Most of its infantry was wiped out, with only a small portion of cavalry escaping. This was one of the most severe defeats Roman forces suffered in Britain. Boudica then advanced on Londinium. At the time, it was a growing commercial center, not yet heavily fortified. When the governor realized he could not defend it with the limited troops available, he made a calculated decision. He abandoned the city. Those who could flee did so. Those who remained were left behind. Londinium was burned. So was Verulamium. Across these Ilmodon, tens of thousands were killed. Roman authority in Britain came close to collapse not because Rome lacked power, but because it had underestimated how fragile its control really was. The rebellion had exposed a critical flaw. Rome could conquer territory quickly, but governing it required more than force. It required stability, and in Britannia, that stability had never truly been secured. Rome did not lose Britain in AD 60, but it came close enough to force a fundamental change in strategy. The uprising led by Boudica had exposed a dangerous truth. Military victory did not equal control. Crushing the rebellion was only the first step. Preventing the next one would require something different. After regrouping, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus made his stand. With a force estimated at around 10,000 troops, he chose a defensive position along a narrow battlefield, likely somewhere along a Roman road with forested terrain protecting his flanks. In front of him stood a much larger force led by Boudica, possibly numbering several times his own. The Britons, confident after a series of victories, advanced in open formation. The battle that followed was decisive. Roman discipline, combined with tactical positioning, overcame numerical disadvantage. After absorbing the initial charge, the legions advanced in tight formation, using coordinated volleys of javelins followed by close combat. The Britons, packed together and unable to maneuver effectively, were driven back into their own lines. What had been a confident advance turned into a collapse. Boudica either fled and took poison or died shortly after. The rebellion ended not with negotiation, but with annihilation. Rome had restored control, but it had also learned a lesson it could not ignore. In the years that followed, Roman policy in Britain shifted. Instead of relying solely on military force, the empire began investing in long-term integration. Local elites were encouraged to adopt Roman customs. Urban centers were expanded. Infrastructure, roads, baths, forums, was built not just for control, but for permanence. The goal was no longer just to occupy Britain, but to reshape it. This transformation is most visible in the construction of towns such as Londinium and Verulamium, which were rebuilt after the destruction. These were not temporary outposts. They were structured urban environments with planned streets, public buildings, and economic networks tied directly to the wider empire. Roman law, language, and architecture began to take root. But even as Rome strengthened its presence in the south, a different reality existed in the north. The further Roman forces pushed into what is now Scotland, the more resistance they encountered. Campaigns continued under leaders such as Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who advanced deep into Caledonian territory during the late 1st century AD. In AD 84, at the Battle of Mons Graupius, Roman forces defeated a large Caledonian army. Tacitus, the Roman historian, records the speech of the Caledonian leader Calgacus, who accused Rome of creating destruction and calling it peace. Despite the victory, the campaign did not result in permanent control. Roman forces reached the limits of what could be sustained logistically. The terrain was difficult, supply lines were stretched, and the cost of holding the territory outweighed its strategic value. This led to a critical shift. Rome stopped trying to expand indefinitely. In AD 122, under Emperor Hadrian, construction began on what would become one of the most iconic structures of Roman Britain, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching approximately 73 miles from the Irish Sea to the North Sea, it marked a clear boundary. Built of stone and turf, supported by forts and watchtowers, it was not just a defensive barrier, it was a statement. Rome was defining its limit. The wall represented a new phase in imperial thinking. Expansion was no longer the priority. Control, stability, and management of existing territory had taken precedence. To the south of the wall lay a province increasingly shaped by Roman systems. To the north remained lands beyond direct control, inhabited by groups Rome would engage but never fully absorb. Life along the wall reflected this balance. Soldiers stationed there came from across the empire regions such as modern-day Spain, Germany, and the Balkans. They were auxiliaries, not Roman citizens at first, serving long terms in exchange for status and land. Archaeological discoveries, including writing tablets from sites like Vindolanda, reveal a surprisingly human side of this frontier. Letters requesting supplies, invitations to social gatherings, and personal messages show that even on the edge of the empire, daily life continued in structured, familiar ways. For nearly 2 centuries after its construction, Hadrian's Wall symbolized a relatively stable frontier. Roman Britain was no longer defined by constant rebellion or rapid expansion. It had entered a period of consolidation, but stability on the surface can hide deeper problems. By the 3rd century, pressures beyond Britain would begin to affect the province in ways that walls and legions alone could not contain. By the early 5th century, the structure of Roman Britain still existed, but only in fragments. Town councils continued to meet, local leaders still used Roman titles, and some administrative systems remained in place. But these were echoes of a system that no longer had the support behind it. Without soldiers to enforce order, without stable currency to sustain trade, and without a central authority able to respond, the province was beginning to come apart. The final break came not with a battle, but with a message. In AD 410, the cities of Britain sent an appeal for help to the Emperor Honorius. Raids had intensified. Coastal settlements were under constant threat. Groups from the north had moved beyond the old frontier. Local defenses were no longer enough. After nearly 4 centuries as part of the Roman world, Britain asked for support troops, resources, anything that could restore stability. The response they received was short and decisive. Honorius instructed the cities to look to their own defenses. In practical terms, it meant one thing: Rome would not return. There was no ceremony marking the end of Roman Britain, no final legion marching out in formation. Instead, the connection dissolved through absence. Units had already been withdrawn over previous decades. Now, the remaining administrative link was severed. What had once been a province of one of the most powerful empires in history was left to manage its own survival. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but a rapid unraveling. At first, towns continued to function. Buildings still stood, roads were still usable, but without the military presence that had driven demand, thousands of soldiers requiring food, equipment, and services, the economic base of urban life weakened. Markets shrank, trade networks broke down. Skilled laborers, no longer supported by a stable system, began to disappear from the cities. Within a few decades, the effects became visible. Public buildings fell into disrepair, bath complexes stopped operating, water systems, which required constant maintenance, began to fail. Roofs were not repaired, streets were no longer maintained. People started leaving. By around AD 430 to 450, major urban centers such as Londinium had been largely abandoned. A city that may once have held tens of thousands was reduced to a small number of inhabitants living among decaying structures. This pattern repeated across Britain. Formerly significant towns like Verulamium and other regional centers saw similar decline. The collapse extended beyond cities. The villa system, which had supported rural elites and agricultural production, depended on trade and a functioning monetary economy. As coin circulation declined, archaeological evidence suggests new coin imports effectively stopped around the early 5th century. Exchange systems shifted. Without reliable currency, large estates became harder to maintain. Villas were abandoned or repurposed into simpler forms of habitation. This was not just a political transformation, it was a structural one. Literacy, once supported by administrative and commercial needs, began to fade. Written records became rare. Over time, the ability to read and write Latin diminished outside of a few religious communities. Construction techniques also changed. Large-scale stone building, a hallmark of Roman engineering, was no longer practiced widely. Timber structures replaced masonry. The knowledge required to build and maintain complex infrastructure was gradually lost. The speed of this transition is striking. Within 1 or 2 generations, many aspects of Roman life that had defined Britain for centuries had disappeared or been reduced to remnants. What remained were physical traces, roads, walls, foundations, but the system that had given them meaning was gone. Yet not everything vanished. Some elements endured, often in altered forms. Christianity, introduced during the later Roman period, continued to exist in parts of Britain. Isolated from continental developments, local Christian communities maintained religious practices and preserved limited forms of literacy. In certain regions, especially in the West, continuity with the Roman past was stronger than elsewhere. At the same time, new groups began to establish themselves, particularly along the eastern and southern coasts. What had once been raiders, Saxon groups crossing the North Sea were now settling. Over time, these settlements would expand, reshaping the cultural and political landscape of post-Roman Britain. The transition was not a single event, but a shift from one world to another. Roman Britain did not fall in a moment. It faded as the systems that sustained it were removed, one by one, until only the outline remained. What remained after the end of Roman rule was not an empty island, but a landscape filled with fragments of a lost system. Roads still cut across the countryside, engineered with a precision that would not be matched again for centuries. Stone walls still stood, though no one maintained them. The outlines of towns remained visible, but their purpose had changed. Britain had not been erased, it had been disconnected. In the decades following AD 410, communities reorganized at a local level. Without centralized authority, power shifted to regional leaders, landowners, former officials, and warlords who could organize defense and secure resources. These groups inherited parts of the Roman system, but they could not sustain it in full. Administration became localized. Long-distance coordination faded. What had once been a province integrated into a vast empire became a patchwork of smaller, self-reliant territories. One of the most significant changes was cultural. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman identity had shaped the elite. Latin had been the language of administration and status. Roman customs had defined what it meant to belong to the system. But as connections with the continent weakened, that identity began to shift. In many regions, local traditions reasserted themselves. In others, new influences arrived. Along the eastern coasts, groups from across the North Sea, commonly referred to as Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, began to settle more permanently. Initially invited in some cases as mercenaries to help defend against raids, they gradually established their own territories. Over time, these settlements expanded inland, bringing with them different languages, social structures, and cultural practices. The balance of power began to change. In the west and north, where Roman influence had always been less complete, a different kind of continuity emerged. Here, communities maintained stronger links to the Romano-British past. Elements of Roman organization, combined with local traditions, shaped new forms of leadership. These regions would later form the basis of early medieval kingdoms that saw themselves, at least in part, as inheritors of what Rome had left behind. It is within this context that one of the most enduring figures of British tradition appears, King Arthur. Whether Arthur was a single historical individual, a composite of multiple leaders, or a later creation, his significance lies in what he represents. The stories describe a leader who defended Britain against incoming forces, who preserved order in a time of chaos, and who stood as a final link to a more organized, Roman-influenced past. These legends begin to emerge generations after the end of Roman rule, suggesting a society trying to understand its own transformation. The memory of Rome, its cities, its order, its power, did not disappear completely. It became something remembered, reshaped, and retold. Meanwhile, certain elements of Roman Britain continued in more practical ways. The road network remained essential, guiding movement and trade long after the administrative system had collapsed. In some areas, former Roman towns were reoccupied in smaller forms or used as fortified sites. Religious institutions, particularly Christian communities, preserved fragments of literacy and learning, acting as one of the few continuous threads connecting the Roman period to what followed. Over time, however, the transformation became complete. The language spoken across much of Britain shifted away from Latin-based systems toward early forms of what would become Old English in the East, while Celtic languages persisted in the West. Political organization changed from imperial administration to regional kingdoms. Economic systems adapted to smaller-scale production and exchange. What had once been Roman Britain no longer existed as a unified concept. And yet, the legacy of Rome did not vanish. It remained embedded in the physical and conceptual foundations of the island. Later rulers who attempted to unify Britain often did so by invoking ideas that had Roman origins, central authority, codified law, and the notion that the island could function as a single political entity. Even when forgotten in detail, the framework endured. The story of Roman Britain, then, is not just about conquest and withdrawal. It is about transformation. For nearly 4 centuries, the island was part of one of the most powerful systems in history. When that system receded, it did not leave a void. It left a structure that others would build upon, reinterpret, and reshape. The empire was gone, but its imprint remained visible in stone, in roads, in stories, and in the idea that Britain itself could be more than a collection of tribes. Stand again on the white cliffs of Dover, with the wind cutting across the same narrow stretch of water that once separated Rome from Britannia. By now, that distance means something different. It is no longer just where the story began, it is where it makes sense. Because everything that followed the invasion, the rebellion, the walls, the cities, the collapse, was shaped by one simple reality. Britain was never the center of the Roman world, it was always the edge. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome held that edge. After the campaigns of Julius Caesar and the full invasion under Claudius, Britain became part of a system that extended far beyond the island itself. That system survived crisis, including the near collapse during the revolt of Boudica, and adapted by redefining its limits under emperors like Hadrian. It built walls instead of expanding, integrated elites instead of relying only on force, and for a time, it worked. By the 2nd century, Britain was not just occupied, it was functioning. Cities like Londinium grew into major urban centers, villas spread across the countryside. Trade networks connected the island to the wider empire. Generations lived and died without ever knowing a world outside Roman rule. But that stability was never self-sustaining. It depended entirely on the strength of Rome, When the empire began to fracture in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Britain felt it slowly at first, then all at once. External pressure increased, internal conflict drained resources. Troops were pulled away not because Britain no longer mattered, but because other regions mattered more. One by one, the elements that had held the province together were removed. By the time of Honorius in AD 410, the system had already weakened beyond repair. His response to Britain's request for help did not destroy Roman rule, it confirmed that it was already gone. And what followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a rapid unraveling of everything that had depended on Rome's presence. Cities declined because the economic networks behind them disappeared. Villas were abandoned because the system that supported large-scale agriculture and trade no longer functioned. Literacy faded because administration no longer required it. Within a few generations, the structures of Roman Britain, political, economic, and cultural, lost their purpose. What remained were fragments. Roads still cut across the land, long after the system that built them had vanished. Stone ruins stood without maintenance, slowly breaking down but never entirely disappearing. And in the minds of the people, something less visible remained, the memory of order. That memory matters more than the ruins. Because even as new groups settled in Britain and new cultures began to form, the idea of what Rome had been did not vanish completely. It changed form. It became part of how later societies understood power, unity, and civilization. The legends that emerged in the centuries after stories of figures like King Arthur reflect not just resistance, but remembrance. They point back to a time when Britain was part of something larger, more structured, more stable. Whether those stories are literal or not is less important than why they exist. They exist because something significant was lost. Roman Britain did not end in a single moment. It faded as the systems that sustained it were withdrawn, leaving behind a landscape that still carried its imprint. The empire did not fall here in battle. It receded, and in doing so, it revealed how much of what people considered permanent had always depended on forces beyond their control. So when you stand on those cliffs and look across that narrow stretch of water, you are not just looking at where Rome once came from. You are looking at the line that defined the limits of its power and the point where, eventually, it chose to let go. Nearly 400 years, long enough to feel permanent, not long enough to last.